The old Chevy pickup truck rumbled down the winding road, its wipers working overtime against the relentless downpour. Jack Miller, a man in his mid-70s with a weathered face and kind eyes, gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Beside him sat Margaret, his wife of 53 years, her silver hair neatly tucked under a floral scarf. They were on their way home to Millbrook, a small town in upstate New York, after spending the weekend with their grandchildren in Albany. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the familiar route into a treacherous journey. Normally, Jack would have enjoyed the drive, taking in the lush green landscape of the Hudson Valley. But tonight, his focus was solely on the road ahead, illuminated by the truck's yellowing headlights. Margaret gazed out the passenger window, her thoughts drifting to the wonderful time they'd had with little Timmy and Sarah. At ages 6 and 4, the kids were bundles of energy, and Margaret couldn't help but smile at the memory of their excited faces as they opened the homemade quilts she'd brought them. "What are you grinning about over there?" Jack asked, a smile tugging at his own lips. Margaret turned to him, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, just thinking about the kids. Did you see how Timmy's eyes lit up when you promised to teach him how to fish next summer?" Jack chuckled, the sound warm and familiar in the cab of the truck. "That boy's gonna be a natural, I can feel it. Just like his daddy was at that age." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after decades of shared life and love. The radio played softly in the background, an old country song crackling through the speakers. As they rounded a bend in the road, Margaret suddenly sat up straight, her hand flying to Jack's arm. "Jack, stop the car," she exclaimed, her voice urgent. Without hesitation, Jack eased off the gas and pulled over to the side of the road. Years of marriage had taught him to trust Margaret's instincts. "What is it, Maggie?" he asked, concern etching his features. Margaret was already fumbling with her seatbelt. "I saw something on the side of the road. It looked like... I'm not sure, but we need to check." Jack nodded, turning off the engine but leaving the headlights on. He reached behind the seat and pulled out 2 rain ponchos they kept for emergencies. "Here, put this on," he said, handing one to Margaret. Together, they stepped out into the rain, the wind whipping around them as they made their way to the spot Margaret had indicated. The ground was soft and muddy, their shoes sinking slightly with each step. As they approached, Jack's headlights illuminated something that made both of them gasp. There, partially hidden in the tall grass, was a large cardboard box. But it wasn't the box that caught their attention, it was the sound coming from inside. A chorus of tiny whimpers, barely audible over the pounding rain. Margaret reached the box first, her hands shaking as she peeled back the soaked cardboard flaps. What she saw inside broke her heart. 20 pairs of eyes looked up at her, belonging to a group of puppies huddled together for warmth. They were a mix of breeds, their fur matted and dirty, shivering from the cold and wet. "Oh, Jack," Margaret breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "Someone's just left them here to die." Jack knelt beside her, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "Who could do such a thing?" he muttered, more to himself than to Margaret. Then, seeing the tears in his wife's eyes, he set his jaw with determination. "Well, we can't leave them here, that's for sure." Without another word, Jack carefully lifted the box, mindful of its precious cargo. The puppies whined and shifted, clearly scared but too weak to put up much of a fuss. Margaret hurried ahead to open the truck's back door, and together they managed to slide the box onto the seat. "We'll take them home," Jack said as they climbed back into the cab, both of them soaked despite the ponchos. "Figure out what to do from there." Margaret nodded, twisting in her seat to look at the box of puppies. Her heart ached for the tiny creatures, abandoned and alone. But a small part of her also felt a spark of excitement. It had been years since they'd had a dog around the house, not since their old retriever, Buddy, had passed away. As Jack carefully maneuvered the truck back onto the road, Margaret's mind was already racing with plans. They'd need to dry the puppies off, get them warm, find something to feed them. It would be a long night, but she was ready for the challenge. The rest of the drive passed in a blur of rain-slicked roads and the occasional whimper from the backseat. When they finally pulled into the driveway of their modest 2-story home, both Jack and Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. "You go on inside and get some towels," Jack said as he turned off the engine. I'll bring in the box. Margaret nodded, hurrying through the rain to unlock the front door. She flicked on lights as she went, grabbing every towel she could find from the linen closet. By the time Jack made it inside with the box, she had transformed their living room into a makeshift puppy nursery, laying out old blankets on the floor. Together, they began the task of drying off each puppy. As Margaret gently rubbed a soft towel over a tiny black and white pup, she couldn't help but coo softly. There, little one. You're safe now. Jack, for his part, was all business, his movements efficient but gentle as he dried puppy after puppy. But Margaret didn't miss the softness in his eyes, the way his gruff exterior melted a bit each time a puppy licked his hand or nuzzled against him. Once the puppies were dry, Jack went to the kitchen to see what they could feed them. He returned with a bowl of warm milk and some leftover chicken, shredded into tiny pieces. It's not ideal, he said, setting the food down, but it'll have to do for tonight. We can go to the store first thing in the morning. Margaret nodded, watching as the puppies, now a bit more lively, began to investigate the food. Some dove right in, while others needed a bit of encouragement. A few of the smaller ones seemed too weak to eat on their own, and Margaret found herself hand-feeding them, her heart swelling with each tiny lick. As the night wore on, Jack and Margaret worked tirelessly to ensure each puppy was fed, warm, and comfortable. They fashioned makeshift beds out of cardboard boxes lined with soft blankets, creating a cozy space for the puppies to sleep. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to peek through the curtains, Jack and Margaret sat back on the couch, exhausted but content. The living room floor was a sea of sleeping puppies, their little chests rising and falling with each breath. Margaret leaned her head on Jack's shoulder, her voice soft with wonder. Look at them, Jack. They're so precious. Jack wrapped an arm around his wife, pulling her close. That they are, Maggie. That they are. He paused, then added with a chuckle, though I have to say, I didn't expect to become a father of 20 at my age. Margaret laughed softly, careful not to wake the sleeping pups. What are we going to do with them all? She asked, though she already had an inkling of an answer forming in her mind. Jack was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. Then he turned to Margaret, a familiar twinkle in his eye. Well, I reckon we've got our work cut out for us. But if anyone can handle it, it's us, don't you think? Margaret smiled, feeling a surge of love for this man who, even after all these years, was still up for any adventure life threw their way. I think you're right, Jack Miller. I think you're absolutely right. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the sleeping puppies, Jack and Margaret sat together on the couch, hand in hand. They knew the days ahead would be challenging, full of vet visits, late-night feedings, and the monumental task of finding homes for 20 puppies. But in that moment, surrounded by the quiet breathing of their unexpected charges, they felt ready for whatever came next. Little did they know, their simple act of kindness on a rainy night was about to set in motion a series of events that would change not only their lives but the lives of many in their small town of Millbrook. The adventure was just beginning, and Jack and Margaret Miller were ready to face it together, just as they had faced everything else in their 53 years of marriage, with love, determination, and a healthy dose of humor. The morning sun streamed through the living room windows, casting a warm glow over the sleeping puppies. Jack stirred first, his back stiff from a night spent on the couch. He looked over at Margaret, still asleep with her head on his shoulder, and smiled softly. Then his gaze fell on the 20 little bundles of fur scattered across their living room floor, and the events of the previous night came rushing back. Maggie, he said gently, giving her shoulder a light squeeze. Time to wake up, dear. We've got a lot to do today. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked confused. Then she saw the puppies, and a mix of emotions played across her face, joy, concern, and determination. Oh my, she said, sitting up straighter. I suppose it wasn't a dream after all. As if on cue, one of the puppies let out a tiny yap, and suddenly the room was alive with movement and noise. Tails wagged, paws scrabbled on the hardwood floor, and 20 hungry mouths began to whine for breakfast. I'll get them some food, Jack said, pushing himself up from the couch with a groan. You start thinking about what we're going to do next. While Jack busied himself in the kitchen, warming up some milk and softening some dog food they'd found in the back of the pantry, left over from when they used to dog sit for their neighbor. Margaret surveyed the scene before her. The puppies were adorable, no doubt about that. But 20 of them? In their small house? It was overwhelming to say the least. She picked up a small golden puppy that had wandered over to her feet, cradling it gently. "What are we going to do with all of you?" she murmured, more to herself than to the puppy. The little dog responded by licking her chin, causing Margaret to laugh despite her worries. Jack returned with 2 large bowls, one of warm milk, the other of softened dog food. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but it'll have to do until we can get to the store." Together, they set about feeding the puppies. It was a messy business, with milk splattering and bits of food flying everywhere, but slowly and surely, each puppy got its fill. As they worked, Jack and Margaret discussed their options. "We can't keep them all," Jack said, stating the obvious. "But we can't just drop them off at the shelter either. You know how overcrowded it is there." Margaret nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "What about Alice?" she suggested suddenly. "She's always been good with animals, and she knows everyone in town. Maybe she could help us find homes for them." Alice Greenwood was their next-door neighbor, a sprightly woman in her 60s who had lived in Millbrook all her life. She was known for her kind heart and her ability to rally the community around a good cause. If anyone could help them with this situation, it would be Alice. "That's a good idea," Jack agreed. "Why don't you give her a call while I clean up this mess?" Margaret nodded and went to the phone, while Jack began the task of wiping up spilled milk and gathering soiled towels. As he worked, he couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of the puppies, their bellies full, stumbling around the living room on unsteady legs. Despite the chaos and the uncertainty of their situation, he had to admit there was something heartwarming about having the house full of life again. Meanwhile, Margaret was on the phone with Alice. "And so we ended up bringing them all home," she was saying. "I know it's a lot to ask, Alice, but we could really use your help." There was a pause as Alice responded, and then Margaret's face broke into a relieved smile. "Oh, thank you, Alice. You're a lifesaver. We'll see you soon." She hung up the phone and turned to Jack. "Alice is on her way. She says she has some ideas about how we can find homes for the puppies." True to her word, Alice arrived at their doorstep less than an hour later. She was a small woman with curly grey hair and bright, intelligent eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Today, those eyes were wide with amazement as she took in the scene in the Millers' living room. "Oh my stars," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "When you said puppies, I didn't realize you meant so many. They're absolutely darling." She knelt down, letting the puppies sniff her hands and lick her fingers. "You poor little things," she cooed. "Abandoned on the side of the road like that. Well, we'll just have to make sure you all find loving homes, won't we?" Jack and Margaret exchanged a look of relief. Alice's enthusiasm was exactly what they needed right now. "So, Alice," Jack said, as Margaret went to put on a pot of coffee, "any ideas on how we can find homes for all these little ones?" Alice straightened up, a determined glint in her eye. "As a matter of fact, I do. Have either of you heard of social media?" Jack and Margaret shared another look, this one of confusion. "You mean like Facebook?" Margaret asked hesitantly. Their granddaughter had set up accounts for them a few years back, but they rarely used them. Alice nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. I was thinking we could create a post about these puppies. Share their story, add some cute pictures. People love this kind of thing online. We might be able to reach a lot of potential adopters that way." Jack looked skeptical. "I don't know, Alice. We're not exactly tech-savvy." "Don't you worry about that," Alice said with a wave of her hand. "I'll take care of all the technical stuff. You just need to help me get some good photos of these little darlings." And so, for the next hour, their living room was transformed into an impromptu photo studio. Alice directed Jack and Margaret as they posed puppies, using blankets as backdrops and toys to catch the puppies' attention. Despite the chaos, puppies squirming out of position, accidents on the blankets, and one memorable moment when a particularly adventurous pup decided to crawl up Jack's shirt, they managed to get a collection of adorable photos. As Margaret served coffee and her homemade blueberry muffins, Alice sat at the dining room table, tapping away at her smartphone. All right, she said finally, looking up with a satisfied smile. I've posted the story on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I've also shared it in some local community groups online. Now we just have to wait and see what kind of response we get. Jack and Margaret peered over her shoulder at the post. Alice had written a heartfelt account of how the puppies were found, emphasizing the need for loving homes. The post ended with a call to action, asking people to share the story and contact them if they were interested in adopting. Do you really think this will work? Margaret asked, hope and doubt warring in her voice. Alice patted her hand reassuringly. Trust me, dear. People love to help, especially when it comes to animals. We just need to give them the opportunity. As if on cue, Alice's phone pinged with a notification. Look, she exclaimed. Someone's already shared the post. And here's a comment from Mrs. Johnson down at the bakery. She says she might be interested in adopting one of the puppies. Over the next few hours, as they worked to keep the puppies fed, clean, and entertained, Alice's phone continued to buzz with notifications. People from all over Millbrook and the surrounding towns were sharing the post, leaving comments, and sending messages asking how they could help. By late afternoon, they had received offers to adopt nearly half of the puppies, as well as donations of food, blankets, and toys. The local vet had even reached out, offering to do checkups and vaccinations for all the puppies at a discounted rate. Jack and Margaret were overwhelmed by the response. I can't believe it, Jack said, shaking his head in wonder. All these people wanting to help. Alice beamed at them. This is what community is all about, she said. When people come together, amazing things can happen. As the day wore on, they began to make plans. They would need to screen potential adopters, arrange vet visits, and figure out how to care for the puppies until they could go to their new homes. It was a daunting task, but with Alice's help and the support of their community, it suddenly seemed manageable. That evening, as Jack and Margaret sat on their porch swing, watching the sun set over the hills, they felt a sense of hope and purpose they hadn't experienced in years. The puppies were inside, settled in their makeshift beds, their futures now looking much brighter than they had just 24 hours ago. Margaret leaned her head on Jack's shoulder, just as she had done the night before. You know, she said softly, when we drove home in the rain last night, I never would have imagined we'd end up here. Jack chuckled, wrapping his arm around her. Life has a funny way of surprising you, doesn't it? As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, Jack and Margaret Miller sat together, surrounded by the quiet of their small town, feeling grateful for the unexpected adventure that had landed on their doorstep. They knew the coming days and weeks would be challenging, but they were ready to face whatever came their way, together, with the help of their friends and neighbors, and with 20 little wagging tails cheering them on. Little did they know, their simple act of kindness was about to spark a movement that would change their community in ways they could never have imagined. The journey of Jack, Margaret, and their 20 unexpected puppies was just beginning, and Millbrook would never be quite the same again. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the stormy night when Jack and Margaret had found the puppies. The Millers were up early, their usual retirement routine disrupted by the needs of their furry houseguests. As Jack made his way downstairs, the sound of yipping puppies and Margaret's gentle cooing greeted him. Well, good morning to you too, he chuckled, stepping carefully around the puppy playpen they'd hastily constructed in the living room. Margaret looked up from where she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by wiggling puppies. Jack, you won't believe it, she said, her eyes shining with excitement. Alice just called. The response to our post has been incredible. Before Jack could respond, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Alice standing there, her arms full of supplies and her face flushed with enthusiasm. Morning, Jack, she chirped, bustling past him into the house. Hope you're ready for a busy day. We've got a lot to do. As Alice set down her load, bags of puppy food, toys, and what looked like a stack of papers, she filled them in on the latest developments. The online post had gone viral overnight, spreading far beyond their small town of Millbrook. People from all over the county, and even from neighboring states, were reaching out to offer help. The local pet store has offered to donate food and supplies, Alice said, ticking off points on her fingers. The vet clinic is ready to do checkups and vaccinations at a discounted rate. And get this, The Millbrook Gazette wants to do a story on you two and the puppies." Jack and Margaret exchanged a look of disbelief. Just 2 days ago, they had been an ordinary retired couple, their days filled with gardening, book club meetings, and the occasional visit from their grandkids. Now, they were at the center of a community-wide effort to save 20 abandoned puppies. As they sat around the kitchen table, sipping coffee and going through Alice's notes, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Sarah Jenkins, the young reporter from the Millbrook Gazette. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, puppies tumbling over each other in the playpen, Alice's organized chaos of supplies spread across the living room, and Jack and Margaret looking slightly overwhelmed but happy. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" Sarah said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah from the Gazette. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. This story, it's just incredible." Over the next hour, Jack and Margaret recounted the events of that rainy night, with Sarah scribbling notes furiously. She asked about their decision to bring the puppies home, their feelings on the community's response, and their plans for the future. "We never expected anything like this," Margaret said, gesturing to the bustling activity around them. "We just knew we couldn't leave those puppies there. Anyone would have done the same." Sarah smiled, shaking her head. "I'm not so sure about that, Mrs. Miller. What you did, it's inspiring people. You're showing everyone the difference that one act of kindness can make." As Sarah was wrapping up the interview, more visitors began to arrive. First came Dr. Thompson, the local veterinarian, ready to give each puppy a thorough checkup. Then came volunteers from the pet store, arms laden with supplies. Throughout the day, a steady stream of community members stopped by, offering help, dropping off donations, or simply wanting to see the puppies for themselves. Jack and Margaret's small home was soon bustling with activity. In the kitchen, a group of volunteers organized by Alice were coordinating donation efforts and creating a schedule for puppy care. In the living room, Dr. Thompson was examining each puppy, giving them clean bills of health and administering their first round of vaccinations. Out in the backyard, a team from the local hardware store was building a larger, more secure enclosure for the puppies. The sound of hammering and friendly chatter filled the air, punctuated by the occasional excited yip from a puppy. As the day wore on, Jack found himself in conversation with Tom Fletcher, owner of the hardware store. "You know, Jack," Tom said, wiping sweat from his brow as he paused in his work, "what you and Margaret did, it's really brought the town together. I can't remember the last time I saw everyone pitch in like this." Jack nodded, looking around at the hive of activity that his home had become. "It's something, all right," he agreed. "Though I have to say, when we brought these little ones home, we never imagined all of this." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the thing about kindness, Jack. You never know how far it'll ripple out." Inside, Margaret was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Mrs. Chen from the local bakery had dropped off a box of pastries for the volunteers. The high school art club was working on posters to help advertise the puppies for adoption. Even Mayor Thompson had stopped by, promising to expedite any permits they might need for the temporary puppy shelter they were creating. As evening approached, the flurry of activity began to die down. Volunteers headed home, promising to return the next day. Dr. Thompson left a stack of care instructions and a promise to return for follow-up visits. Alice was the last to leave, her eyes tired but satisfied as she hugged Jack and Margaret goodbye. "You two should be proud," she said. "Look at what you've started." Finally alone, Jack and Margaret sat on their porch swing, much as they had the night before. But now, instead of uncertainty, they felt a sense of awe and gratitude. "Can you believe all this, Jack?" Margaret asked, gesturing to their transformed backyard, now home to a sturdy puppy enclosure. Jack shook his head, a smile playing on his lips. "Not in a million years, Maggie. But you know what? I wouldn't change a thing." As they sat there, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, they could hear the soft sounds of the puppies settling down for the night. The day had been a whirlwind, but a good one. They had seen firsthand the power of community, the way people could come together to make a difference. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. The story in the Millbrook Gazette sparked even more interest, and soon, larger news outlets picked up the tale. A reporter from a national morning show even came to do a segment on the Millbrook miracle, as people had started calling it. Adoption applications poured in faster than they could process them. Alice, bless her heart, took charge of the vetting process, ensuring that each puppy would go to a loving, responsible home. She organized meet and greets, home visits, and even puppy training sessions for prospective adopters. The Millers' home had become the unofficial headquarters of what was now being called the Millbrook Puppy Rescue. Volunteers came and went at all hours, helping with feeding, cleaning, and socializing the puppies. Jack and Margaret found themselves busier than they'd been in years, but also more energized and purposeful. One particularly memorable day came when a school bus pulled up in front of their house. Ms. Rodriguez, the elementary school principal, had organized a field trip for the third-grade class to learn about animal rescue and the importance of community service. Jack and Margaret watched with joy as the children, under the watchful eyes of their teachers and some volunteers, took turns playing with the puppies. The sound of childish laughter mixed with excited yips filled the air, and more than one child left that day begging their parents to adopt a puppy. As word spread, donations began to come in from far and wide. Pet food companies sent pallets of puppy chow. A local textile mill donated soft blankets. Someone even started an online fundraiser that raised thousands of dollars for the puppy's care and future needs. But perhaps the most touching moments were the quieter ones. Like when old Mr. Granger, known for being a bit of a grump, showed up one afternoon with a handmade puppy toy for each of the 20 dogs. Or when little Timmy, a boy from down the street who was often too shy to speak, started coming by every day after school to read stories to the puppies, slowly gaining confidence with each visit. Through it all, Jack and Margaret marveled at how their simple act of kindness had snowballed into something so much bigger than themselves. They had always loved their town, but now they were seeing a side of Millbrook they'd never known existed. The generosity, the community spirit, the way people came together to help, it was truly heartwarming. One evening, about a month after they'd found the puppies, Jack and Margaret sat in their living room, surrounded by sleeping puppies and a mountain of paperwork. They were going over the adoption applications, making sure every I was dotted and every T crossed. "You know, Maggie," Jack said, looking up from a form, "I think we've done a good thing here." Margaret smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "We have, Jack. But it's not just us. It's everyone. This whole town, it's like the puppies woke something up in Millbrook." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. In the past month, they'd seen their community come together in ways they never could have imagined. People who had lived as strangers for years were now working side by side, united by their desire to help. The puppies had become a symbol of hope, of the good that could be accomplished when people came together. As they sat there, surrounded by the tangible results of their community's love and effort, Jack and Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. They knew that the journey wasn't over, there were still puppies to be adopted, funds to be managed, and a newfound community spirit to be nurtured. But they were ready for whatever came next, bolstered by the knowledge that they had an entire town standing behind them. The power of community, they had learned, was a force to be reckoned with. And in Millbrook, that power had been awakened by 20 tiny puppies and 2 retirees who had simply decided to do the right thing. As Jack and Margaret drifted off to sleep that night, lulled by the soft breathing of the puppies, they knew that their lives, and their town, would never be quite the same again. And that, they agreed, was a very good thing indeed. As the weeks turned into months, the Millbrook Puppy Rescue Operation, headquartered in Jack and Margaret's home, had become a well-oiled machine. The initial flurry of activity had settled into a steady rhythm of care, socialization, and the ongoing process of finding the perfect homes for each of the 20 puppies. The puppies, no longer the tiny, helpless creatures Jack and Margaret had found on that rainy night, were growing by leaps and bounds. Their personalities were blossoming, each one unique and endearing in its own way. There was Buddy, the golden retriever mix with a penchant for carrying around shoes twice his size. Daisy, the spotted spaniel who loved nothing more than to curl up in laps for naps. And then there was Rocket, the energetic border collie mix who lived up to his name with his lightning-fast runs around the yard. Jack and Margaret found themselves falling in love with each puppy, even as they knew their time together was limited. The goal had always been to find loving, permanent homes for each of the dogs, But as the day of the first adoption drew near, the Millers discovered it was harder than they'd anticipated to say goodbye. The morning of the first adoption dawned bright and clear. Jack was up early, unable to sleep with the mix of excitement and sadness swirling in his chest. He made his way downstairs to find Margaret already in the kitchen, baking up a storm. "Maggie," he said, eyeing the growing pile of muffins and cookies on the counter, "I think you might be stress baking." Margaret paused, a smudge of flour on her cheek, and gave a rueful laugh. "I suppose I am," she admitted. It feels like we're sending our children off to college or something. I know it's silly, but I can't help it." Jack wrapped his arms around her, planting a kiss on the top of her head. "It's not silly at all," he assured her. "We've poured our hearts into these pups. It's okay to feel a little sad about saying goodbye." Before they could say more, there was a knock at the door. Alice let herself in, her arms full of paperwork and a camera slung around her neck. "Ready for the big day?" she asked, her enthusiasm infectious despite the bittersweet mood. The Johnsons were scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m. to take home Max, a playful brown puppy with floppy ears and a white-tipped tail. As the clock ticked closer to the appointed time, Jack, Margaret, and Alice bustled about, making sure everything was in order. The adoption papers were ready, Max's favorite toys and blanket were packed, and Margaret had prepared a care package with homemade treats and detailed instructions on Max's routine. At precisely 10 a.m., a minivan pulled into the driveway. Out tumbled the Johnson family, Tom and Lisa, their 2 children Emma and Tyler, and even Grandma Johnson. Their excitement was palpable as they made their way to the front door. Margaret greeted them warmly, ushering them into the living room where Max was waiting, tail wagging furiously at the sight of visitors. The kids immediately dropped to their knees, giggling as Max showered them with puppy kisses. "Oh, he's even more perfect than we remembered," Lisa Johnson said, her eyes shining as she watched her children play with their soon-to-be new family member. As Alice went over the adoption paperwork with Tom and Lisa, Jack and Margaret found themselves hanging back, watching the scene unfold. There was joy in seeing the obvious love the Johnsons had for Max, but also a twinge of sadness. This puppy, who had been a part of their daily lives for months, was about to leave. Finally, with papers signed and care instructions reviewed, it was time for Max to go to his new home. Margaret knelt down, giving the puppy one last hug. "You be a good boy, Max," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to have such a wonderful life." As the Johnsons loaded Max into their van, the entire neighborhood seemed to come out to say goodbye. Neighbors waved from their porches, and a few of the regular volunteers had stopped by to witness this milestone moment. Alice snapped photos, capturing the mix of smiles and tears on everyone's faces. Once the Johnsons had driven away, Margaret turned to Jack, burying her face in his chest. He held her close, his own eyes misty. "One down, 19 to go," he said softly, trying to inject some humor into the moment. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Word had spread quickly about Max's successful adoption, and suddenly the phone was ringing off the hook with people eager to schedule their own adoption appointments. That evening, as Jack and Margaret sat on their porch swing, they reflected on the day's events. The house felt a little emptier without Max, but there was also a sense of accomplishment. They had seen firsthand the joy on the Johnsons' faces, the instant bond formed between the family and their new puppy. "You know," Jack said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think this might be the most important thing we've ever done." Margaret nodded, understanding completely. "It's not just about finding homes for the puppies," she mused. "It's about creating families, bringing joy to people's lives." As the days went by, more and more of the puppies found their forever homes. Each adoption was a unique experience, filled with its own mix of joy and bittersweetness. There was Bella, the shy little girl puppy, who went home with the Smiths, a quiet couple who promised to give her all the patience and love she needed to come out of her shell. Jack and Margaret knew she was in good hands when Mr. Smith got down on the floor, speaking softly to Bella until she cautiously crept over to lick his hand. Then there was Rufus, the boisterous Labrador mix, who found his match in the Anderson family. With 3 active boys under the age of 10, the Andersons had energy to spare, and Rufus would fit right in with their adventurous lifestyle. One of the most memorable adoptions came when Henry Davis, a local widower, came to meet the puppies. Henry had recently lost his wife of 40 years, and his children thought a dog might help with his loneliness. As Henry sat in the living room, surrounded by puppies vying for his attention, his sad eyes began to light up for the first time in months. "I'll take them," Henry said suddenly, gesturing to the 5 puppies that had settled around him. Jack, Margaret, and Alice exchanged startled looks. "Them?" Margaret asked gently. "All 5. Henry nodded, a determined set to his jaw. "My house is too quiet," he explained. "These little ones, they'll fill it with life again. And I've got plenty of love to give." And so, in a surprise turn of events, 5 of the puppies, Daisy, Charlie, Lola, Buddy, and Milo, found their forever home together with Henry. The day they left was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. Jack and Margaret knew they'd miss the quintet of pups terribly, but seeing Henry's renewed sense of purpose as he prepared to take them home was worth any sadness they felt. As the number of puppies in their care dwindled, Jack and Margaret found themselves with mixed emotions. On one hand, they were thrilled to see each puppy go to a loving home. The updates they received from the new families, photos of the puppies settling in, stories of first walks and playful antics, filled them with joy. On the other hand, they couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. These puppies had changed their lives in ways they never could have imagined. The house, once filled with the chaos of 20 growing dogs, was becoming quieter. The steady stream of volunteers slowed to a trickle. It was Alice who helped them see the bigger picture. "You two have done something amazing," she told them one evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, looking through photos of the adopted puppies in their new homes. "You've not only saved these dogs, but you've brought so much joy to so many people. And look at how it's changed Millbrook." She was right, of course. The puppy rescue mission had transformed their sleepy little town. People who had once been strangers were now friends, brought together by their desire to help. The sense of community had grown stronger, with people now more likely to reach out and help a neighbor in need. The last puppy to be adopted was Rocket, the energetic border collie mix. He had been passed over a few times due to his high energy levels, but Jack and Margaret knew the right family would come along eventually. And they did, the Taylors, a young couple who owned a large farm just outside of town. With acres of land to run and play, and owners who were committed to giving him the exercise and stimulation he needed, Rocket had found his perfect match. The day Rocket left was bittersweet. As Margaret helped load his things into the Taylor's truck, she found herself blinking back tears. This puppy, the last of the 20 they had rescued on that rainy night months ago, represented the end of a chapter in their lives. But as she watched the Taylors drive away, Rocket's head hanging out the window in excitement, Margaret felt a sense of peace wash over her. They had done it. All 20 puppies, once abandoned and facing an uncertain future, were now in loving homes. That evening, Jack and Margaret sat in their suddenly quiet living room. The puppy playpen had been packed away, the dog toys donated to the local shelter. It felt like the end of an era. "Well, Maggie," Jack said, reaching out to take her hand, "we did it. How do you feel?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Proud," she said finally. "Grateful. A little sad. But mostly I feel like we've been part of something truly special." Jack nodded, understanding completely. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I was thinking, maybe this doesn't have to be the end." Margaret looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "Well," Jack continued, a spark of excitement in his eyes, "we've learned a lot these past few months. About animal rescue, about bringing the community together. Maybe we could do something more permanent. A real animal rescue center for Millbrook." As Jack outlined his idea, Margaret felt a surge of excitement. Yes, this chapter might be ending, but perhaps an even more amazing one was about to begin. As they talked late into the night, planning and dreaming, they knew that the legacy of their 20 rescued puppies would live on, continuing to bring joy and create positive change in their community for years to come. The journey that had begun on a rainy night with 20 abandoned puppies had transformed not just Jack and Margaret's lives, but the entire town of Millbrook. And as they looked to the future, they knew that the power of compassion, community, and love would continue to create ripples of change, one wagging tail at a time. The summer sun beat down on Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town square. It had been 6 months since Jack and Margaret Miller had found those 20 puppies on a rainy night, and the town was still buzzing with the after-effects of their simple act of kindness. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow as he hammered the last nail into place. He stepped back to admire his handiwork, a brand new little free pantry standing proudly next to the town's existing little free library. The idea had come from Margaret, inspired by the outpouring of donations they'd received during their puppy rescue mission. "Looks good, Jack," called out Tom Fletcher from the hardware store. He donated the materials for the project, part of the town's new Millbrook Cares initiative. Jack grinned, giving Tom a thumbs up. "Couldn't have done it without your help, Tom. Thanks again." As if on cue, Margaret appeared, her arms laden with canned goods and other non-perishables. Alice trailed behind her, carrying even more supplies. Together, they began stocking the little pantry. "You know," Margaret mused as she arranged the items, "I never would have thought finding those puppies would lead to all this." Alice nodded in agreement. "It's like you two threw a pebble into a pond, and the ripples just keep spreading." Indeed, the ripples of their act had spread far and wide. The story of the Millbrook puppy rescue had captured hearts well beyond the town limits. Local news stations had picked up the story, and it had even caught the attention of a national morning show. Suddenly, Millbrook found itself in the spotlight, hailed as an example of the power of community and compassion. The attention had brought unexpected benefits to the small town. Tourism had picked up, with people coming from neighboring states to visit the town with a heart of gold. Local businesses were thriving, and there was a newfound sense of pride among the residents. But more importantly, it had sparked a wave of kindness that showed no signs of slowing down. As Jack, Margaret, and Alice stood back to admire the fully stocked pantry, Mayor Thompson approached, a broad smile on his face. "Jack, Margaret," he greeted them warmly. "I've got some exciting news. Remember that proposal you submitted for a permanent animal rescue center?" Jack and Margaret exchanged a look of anticipation. They'd submitted the proposal weeks ago, unsure if anything would come of it. The mayor's smile widened. "Well, I'm happy to tell you that the town council has unanimously approved it. We're going to convert the old Johnson farm on the edge of town into Millbrook's very own animal rescue and adoption center." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth in surprise, while Jack's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. Mayor Thompson nodded. "Dead serious. Your puppy rescue operation showed us all what's possible when this community comes together. We want to keep that spirit alive." As the news sank in, Alice let out a whoop of joy, pulling Jack and Margaret into a group hug. Passers-by stopped to see what the commotion was about, and soon a small crowd had gathered, buzzing with excitement as the news spread. In the days that followed, planning for the new rescue center kicked into high gear. The whole town seemed to rally around the project. The local construction company offered their services at a discounted rate. The high school art club volunteered to paint murals on the walls. Even old Mr. Granger, who had surprised everyone with his handmade puppy toys months ago, offered to build custom beds for the animals. But the wave of kindness wasn't confined to just animal rescue. It seemed that Jack and Margaret's act had awakened a spirit of generosity throughout Millbrook. The local diner started a pay-it-forward wall, where customers could prepay for meals for those who couldn't afford them. The town's knitting circle, led by Margaret's friend Edna, began making blankets for the homeless shelter in the next town over. The high school students organized a tutoring program for younger kids, volunteering their time after school. One particularly touching initiative came from Henry Davis, the widower who had adopted 5 of the original puppies. Inspired by how the dogs had brought new life to his days, Henry started a program bringing shelter dogs to visit seniors in the local nursing home. The joy on the faces of both the residents and the dogs was a sight to behold. As summer turned to fall, Jack and Margaret found themselves busier than ever. Between overseeing the construction of the new rescue center and fielding calls from other towns asking for advice on starting their own community initiatives, their days were full. One crisp October morning, as they sat on their porch swing enjoying a rare quiet moment, Margaret turned to Jack with a twinkle in her eye. "You know, Jack," she said, a hint of mischief in her voice, "for a couple of old retirees, We sure have gotten ourselves into a whole heap of work. Jack chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. That we have, Maggie. That we have. But I wouldn't have it any other way. Margaret leaned into him, nodding in agreement. Me neither. You know, I was thinking about that night we found the puppies. If you had told me then that 6 months later we'd be running an animal rescue center and be the talk of the state, I'd have thought you were crazy. Life has a funny way of surprising you, Jack mused. But I think the real surprise has been seeing how many good people there are in this world, just waiting for a chance to help. As if to prove his point, at that moment, Alice's car pulled into their driveway. She hopped out, waving a stack of papers. You two aren't going to believe this, she called out as she hurried up the path. Remember that interview you did for the state newspaper last month? Well, it's gone viral online. We've been getting calls all morning from people all over the country asking how they can start similar programs in their towns. Jack and Margaret exchanged a look of amazement. The ripples were turning into waves. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Jack and Margaret found themselves hosting conference calls, writing up guides, and even doing a few video interviews to help spread the message of community kindness. They were careful to emphasize that it wasn't about them, it was about the power of one small act of kindness to inspire others. The Millbrook Animal Rescue Center opened its doors on a beautiful November day. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house when Jack and Margaret cut the ribbon. The center was everything they had dreamed of and more, a place of hope, love, and second chances for animals in need. But perhaps the most touching moment came later that evening. As Jack and Margaret were locking up after a long day, a car pulled into the parking lot. Out stepped the Johnson family, the very first adopters from their original group of puppies. Max, now a fully grown dog, bounded out of the car, his tail wagging furiously as he recognized Jack and Margaret. As the Johnsons approached, little Emma proudly held up a handmade poster. "We made this for you," she said shyly, handing it to Margaret. The poster was covered in photos of Max and the Johnson family, surrounded by hand-drawn hearts and the words "Thank you for our best friend" in colorful letters. As Margaret knelt down to hug Emma, Jack found himself blinking back tears. This, he realized, was what it was all about. Not the publicity or the accolades, but the lives they had touched, the families they had helped create, the love they had put into the world. That night, as Jack and Margaret got ready for bed, they took a moment to look out their bedroom window. The lights of Millbrook twinkled in the distance, and somewhere out there were 20 dogs, once abandoned and alone, now happy in their forever homes. "We did good, Maggie," Jack said softly, pulling his wife close. Margaret nodded, her heart full. "We did, Jack. And the best part is, I think we're just getting started." As they drifted off to sleep, the Millers knew that their journey was far from over. The wave of kindness they had set in motion was still growing, reaching far beyond the borders of their small town. And in homes across Millbrook and beyond, people were going to bed that night thinking about how they too could make a difference. The story of Jack, Margaret, and the 20 puppies had become more than just a heartwarming tale. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder of the power of compassion, and a testament to the fact that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples that turn into waves, changing the world one community at a time. And in Millbrook, a town forever changed by that one rainy night and 20 wagging tails, the wave of kindness showed no signs of slowing down. Instead, it continued to grow, touching more lives, inspiring more acts of generosity, and proving that sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest acts of love. The gentle creaking of the porch swing filled the air as Jack and Margaret Miller sat side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a warm evening in late spring, almost a year to the day since they had found those 20 puppies on the side of the road. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, reminiscent of that fateful rainy night that had changed everything. Jack reached over and took Margaret's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Can you believe it's been a year, Maggie?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. Margaret shook her head, a smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday, and other times it feels like a lifetime ago." As they sat there, enjoying the peacefulness of the evening, their minds wandered back over the events of the past year. So much had changed, not just for them, but for the entire town of Millbrook. The Millbrook Animal Rescue Center, or MARC as it had come to be known, was thriving. What had started as a dream born from their experience with the 20 puppies had grown into a full-fledged operation, saving hundreds of animals and finding them loving homes. Jack and Margaret were still heavily involved, but they had also built a team of dedicated staff and volunteers who shared their passion for animal welfare. But MARC was just the beginning. The wave of kindness that had swept through Millbrook showed no signs of receding. If anything, it had grown stronger with time. The Millbrook Cares initiative, which had started with the little free pantry in the town square, had expanded to include a variety of community programs. There was now a community garden where people grew fresh produce to donate to local food banks. The high school had started a mentorship program, pairing students with local businesses for internships and job shadowing. Even the annual Millbrook Festival had been reimagined, with a focus on celebrating and promoting local acts of kindness. As Jack and Margaret reflected on all this, they couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and amazement. Their simple act of compassion had sparked something truly remarkable. "You know, Jack," Margaret said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I was thinking about something Alice said to us a while back. Remember how she compared our finding the puppies to throwing a pebble in a pond?" Jack nodded, a fond smile crossing his face at the mention of their dear friend. Alice had been with them every step of the way, her energy and optimism a constant source of support. "Well," Margaret continued, "I think she was right, but I don't think she realized just how big that pond would turn out to be." Jack chuckled softly. "You've got that right, Maggie. Who would have thought our little town would end up making national news?" Indeed, Millbrook's transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. Over the past year, they had been featured in several national publications and news programs. People from all over the country had reached out, asking for advice on how to start similar initiatives in their own communities. Jack and Margaret had lost count of the number of interviews they'd given, the conferences they'd spoken at, the visitors they'd welcomed to Millbrook. At first, all the attention had been overwhelming, but they had quickly realized it was an opportunity to spread their message of kindness and community even further. "Remember that group from Ohio that visited last month?" Jack asked, his eyes twinkling with the memory. Margaret nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "How could I forget? Those young people were so enthusiastic. It was inspiring to see how eager they were to make a difference in their own town." The group Jack was referring to was a delegation from a small town in Ohio that had been struggling with economic hardship and community apathy. They had read about Millbrook's transformation and had come to see for themselves what was possible when a community came together. Jack and Margaret had spent days showing them around, introducing them to various community leaders, and sharing their experiences. By the time the group left, they were brimming with ideas and determination to create positive change in their own community. It wasn't just out-of-towners who sought their advice, either. Jack and Margaret found themselves becoming something of local celebrities in Millbrook. People would stop them on the street to share stories of how the town's newfound spirit of kindness had touched their lives. Young couples would ask for their blessing before adopting a pet from MARC. Even the mayor would occasionally call to get their input on new community initiatives. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, Jack stood up, gently pulling Margaret to her feet. "Come on, Maggie. I want to show you something." Hand in hand, they walked to the backyard, where Jack flicked on the porch light. There, illuminated in the soft glow, was a sight that never failed to warm their hearts: a beautiful garden, filled with flowers of every color imaginable. This garden was their latest project, a memorial of sorts to the 20 puppies that had started it all. 20 different types of flowers, each chosen to represent one of the puppies they had rescued. There were sunflowers for Max, the energetic golden retriever mix who had been the first to be adopted. Daisies for, well, Daisy, the spotted spaniel who had found a home with old Mr. Henry along with 4 of her siblings. Bright red tulips for Rocket, the border collie mix who had been the last to be adopted. As they stood there, taking in the beauty of the garden, Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Jack," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "It's perfect." Jack wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I thought it would be nice to have a place to remember where it all began," he said softly. "And to celebrate how far we've come." They stood there for a while, lost in their memories. They thought about each of the 20 puppies, remembering their unique personalities and the joy they had brought during their time with Jack and Margaret. They recalled the day they had found them, scared and alone on the side of the road, and marveled at how that moment of compassion had set in motion such incredible changes. As they turned to head back inside, Margaret paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Jack," she said slowly, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we wrote down our story." Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean, Maggie?" "Well," she explained, "we've told our story so many times now, to reporters and visitors and people looking for advice. But I was thinking, maybe if we wrote it all down, really told the whole story from beginning to end, it could reach even more people. Maybe it could inspire others to start their own waves of kindness in their communities." Jack nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "You know, I think that's a wonderful idea. We could include stories from around town, show how one small act can grow into something so much bigger." As they discussed the idea, their excitement grew. They could see it clearly, a book that would not only tell their story, but would serve as a guide for others looking to make a difference in their own communities. They would share the challenges they faced, the lessons they learned, and the joy they experienced along the way. That night, as they lay in bed, Jack and Margaret's minds were buzzing with ideas for their book. They knew it would be a big undertaking, but they were ready for the challenge. After all, they had faced bigger challenges before and come out stronger for it. As Margaret drifted off to sleep, she found herself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past year. From that rainy night when they found the puppies, to the opening of Mark, to the transformation of Millbrook into a beacon of community kindness, it had been a whirlwind of change and growth. But more than that, she thought about the people they had met along the way. The volunteers who had given their time and energy to help care for the puppies. The families who had opened their homes and hearts to adopt them. The community leaders who had embraced the spirit of kindness and worked to spread it throughout Millbrook. The visitors from other towns who had come seeking inspiration and left with renewed hope and determination. In each of these people, Margaret saw a reflection of the same compassion and desire to make a difference that had driven her and Jack to stop on that rainy night and rescue 20 abandoned puppies. It was a reminder that the capacity for kindness existed in everyone, just waiting for the right moment to shine through. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last thought was one of gratitude. Gratitude for Jack, her partner in all things. Gratitude for their community, which had come together in ways she never could have imagined. And gratitude for those 20 puppies, who had unknowingly set in motion a wave of kindness that continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the borders of their small town. The next morning, Jack and Margaret woke up early, energized by their new project. Over breakfast, they began to outline their book, jotting down ideas and stories they wanted to include. As they worked, they realized that their story wasn't just about the puppies, or even about animal rescue. It was about the power of community, the ripple effect of kindness, and the ability of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. They decided to reach out to others in Millbrook to contribute their own stories of how the Millbrook miracle, as some had taken to calling it, had affected their lives. They wanted the book to be a true reflection of their community's journey. In the weeks and months that followed, Jack and Margaret threw themselves into their writing project with the same enthusiasm they had shown for the puppy rescue. They interviewed neighbors, collected stories, and pored over old news articles and photographs. The process of writing their story brought back a flood of memories, both challenging and joyful. They relived the exhaustion and uncertainty of those first few days with the puppies, the excitement of each successful adoption, and the gradual transformation of their town. As word spread about their book project, they began receiving messages from people in other towns and cities who had heard about Millbrook's story and wanted to share how it had inspired them to start their own community initiatives. Jack and Margaret decided to include some of these stories as well, to show how far the ripples of their initial act of kindness had spread. 1 year after they began writing, Jack and Margaret's book, 20 Wagging Tails, How a Rainy Night Rescue Sparked a Wave of Kindness, was published. The response was overwhelming. The book quickly became a bestseller, resonating with readers across the country who were inspired by the Millers' story and eager to create positive change in their own communities. But for Jack and Margaret, The true measure of their book's success wasn't in sales figures or reviews. It was in the messages they received from readers who had been moved to action by their story. People wrote to tell them about community gardens they had started, animal rescue efforts they had organized, and neighborhood support systems they had created, all inspired by the story of Millbrook's transformation. As they sat on their porch swing on a warm summer evening, 2 years after that fateful rainy night, Jack and Margaret marveled at the journey they had been on. Their lives had changed in ways they never could have imagined, all because they had chosen to stop and help 20 abandoned puppies. "You know, Maggie," Jack said, his voice soft with wonder, "when I retired, I thought our biggest adventures were behind us. But look at us now." Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes twinkling. "Just goes to show, Jack Miller, you're never too old to make a difference." As the sun set on another day in Millbrook, Jack and Margaret sat contentedly, surrounded by the flowers in their memorial garden. They knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, with open hearts and a willingness to help others. And they knew that somewhere out there, 20 dogs, now grown but forever puppies in their hearts, were living happy lives, unaware of the incredible legacy they had helped to create. The story of Jack, Margaret, and the 20 puppies had become more than just a tale of animal rescue. It had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of kindness, and a reminder that even the smallest act of compassion can create waves of change that ripple out into the world in ways we can never fully imagine. And in Millbrook, a town forever changed by love, compassion, and 20 wagging tails, the legacy of that rainy night continued to grow, touching more lives and inspiring more acts of kindness with each passing day.